Hello, I'm Christopher Moore. I'm host of Book Talk Conversations, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor George Church, who is a professor of genetics at Harvard Medical School and also holds another appointment as a professor of health science and technology at Harvard and MIT. Now, George Church is indeed an original thinker. All one has to do is look at his record of accomplishments, which span multiple domains. His professional contributions include sequencing of the genome and interpreting such data, also in synthetic biology, genome engineering, and with mapping of brain activity in the area of neuroscience. He's co-invented several different uses of DNA, including detectors for dark matter, anti-cancer nanorobots, and strategies for data storage, which are a million times denser than our conventional hard disk. And in March 2015, his genetics research team at Harvard successfully copied some of the woolly mammoth genes into the genome of an Asian elephant. So from the foundations of biology to the foundations of the universe, sequencing to dark matter and resurrection of the woolly mammoth, it is with great pride that I have George Church discussing the books which were foundational to his worldview, his perspective, growing up as a child. The idea is, by understanding what those formative books have been, we're able to decode at least a bit of how the architecture of this original thinker's brain was wired. So before we actually start with the first set of books, I would like to ask Professor Church a little bit about his early reading environment. What was the context of your early book reading? I mean, I think the first books that we're going to be talking about, you were maybe 10 years old. So rather than asking you as a professor at Harvard, I'm asking you to kind of recreate for us what it was like in that context when you were a young boy picking up and sitting down and reading a book.
My family was quite literate. My mother was a lawyer and a psychologist, licensed, and my father was a physician, and we had a lot of books. I was unfortunately a little dyslexic, and so I was particularly attracted to books that had a good visual component, images and so forth. And that helped me eventually outgrow it, partially anyway. It wasn't a science or engineering environment at all. I didn't know any for many years. Didn't know any, but I think having parents who are interested in me learning math and physics and so on was very helpful.
So your parents would have bought the first books that we're going to be talking about for you, and introduced you into a book reading culture.
That's right. They had they had gigantic bookcases in the hallways from many generations back in their family, and they did buy modern books like the Time Life series on nature and science, and Collier's Encyclopedia they were actually stored in my room. So that was a big thrill for me to have the most up-to-date books at my fingertips, even though I could.
So
could
was reading then a family activity?
Not so much in me growing up as it was when I raised my own child. That there was definitely a family activity. It might have been a family activity before my recollection, but I had a nanny for part of that time, and I just
Right.
I know, but it certainly was. I had a lot of quiet alone time that I would fill with either reading or experiments.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because reading does require a certain appetite for solitude and being alone and being able to lose yourself in the reading experience. Some people are able to do that better than others, but when you're 8 or 10 years old, the ability to focus attention for a long period on a book is certainly a question today. Maybe it was less of a question when you were 8 or 10 years old, when there weren't the other distractions that we have at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, there was almost no distractions. We lived on the edge of town, on the bay, on the water. There was relatively little interest in television until later. I mean, we had one, but it wasn't really captivating until I was about, I don't know, almost ready to go off to school. Then I lost it again. Lost the access.
Did you discuss the books you were reading with your family or with teachers, or what was your connection with the books you were reading with others around you?
Yeah, not so much. I would tend to find puzzles and then try to puzzle them out. So, for example, once I found a dragonfly nymph, and I had no idea what it was until it disappeared and a dragonfly appeared, and I thought maybe the dragonfly had eaten it. So I went to the books and figured that out. Really, with nobody, really without consulting anybody before or after. I was very proud of it, but I didn't really know how to articulate that to other people, uh, as I recall, until now. Um,
So
but
it's
I would
interesting.
also
So
I would look at books and say, could I do that? Right? So there were some things that were clearly inaccessible to me, but some books, like Luther Burbank, I would immediately go out and try to graft things in the yard and succeeded. I was surprised that
right.
something that seemed like lofty science was actually achievable by a young kid.
So as a young child, you really learned the notion of research and experimentation based on the knowledge that you obtained from your research.
But I didn't call it. None of us called it that because there was nobody in my environment that had any science or engineering background. We did have a family electrician named Stanley Starr who did help me with electricity, not really electronics,
Right.
early on. But that was it.
Okay. Let's have a look at the first series of books that you read between ages 11 and 17, which is a Time Life series on nature and science, 51 volumes in total. And some of the titles, just for the viewers, were The Body, The Cell. These are all separate books. Energy, The Engineer, Flight, Food and Nutrition, Plant Molecules, Health and Disease, The Mind, The Physician, Planets, and so forth. Are there some of these books that were more inspiring for you than others?
Um, yeah, there were definitely some that I would return to again and again, and even though I could barely read, had a fairly good memory. I think when you're young, there's a giant vacuum inside your brain, and it just siphons up whatever it
Sure.
fills it up with something until you have something meaningful to fill it up. So I could find almost any picture that I remembered, and most of them made a big impact on me. They were either what a kid would call gross, or they were just some part of the world I had never seen before, and so they made a much bigger impression on me than than you might imagine.
Right.
So,
One of the things looking at the list of these 50 odd books, it makes me think of that famous quote from Berlin: "The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing." And it seems to me that this particular series is one that would encourage one to be a fox.
yes, I think I was inclined that direction from a very early age, and still to this day. When I was looking for a major in college, I tried every way I could think of, and even to not major, to do everything. Um, and even though I only spent 2 years in college, I did get two majors and a bunch of things that a bunch of other things. So, and then I found crystallography, which was a kind of I considered a Fox-like enterprise, because you really had to know math and computer science and physics and chemistry and biology in order to just keep your head above water. So that's what I was looking for, and it might have been influenced by a series like that, where you really felt like you could familiarize yourself, at least on a visual basis, with all these fields.
Yeah, you were talking about puzzles and paradox, and really original thinkers find that intriguing, that world of going in and solving, problem solving when there's a puzzle and a paradox, rather than finding it frightening or something to avoid. They actually enjoy that process because it requires them to assemble reality in a particular way that seems to resolve a contradiction or to complete a puzzle.
Yeah, I was very intrigued by things that would normally scare people. I wasn't that interested in horror stories, but I mean, I wasn't scared by it. I wasn't interested in them, but I was interested in anything that was true that was weird. So, for example, I would, read Ripley's Believe It or Not to my cousins, and they would get all freaked out about it. But I just thought it was fascinating, people that would have horns coming out of their heads and things like that, that I now know are definitely true. So,
was there a connection
anyway.
between this kind of home reading and going to school? I mean, when you're 8, 9, 10 years old, you're going to school. You've got books there. I mean, did you take some of these books from this series to school and share them with friends or teachers?
I don't remember sharing them with anybody, not even family members. It wasn't because I was hoarding them. I just didn't think that they would be interested. And school I considered wasn't really about learning. I mean, it was it was like I don't know, it was like a holding zone. It was a place where you were babysat or something, because I could finish the homework, by the time I got home. It was that easy. And so I just almost everything I learned from my environment, the bay and the little forest in my backyard, and in the books.
So it was really self-motivation as opposed to a teacher or someone like that saying, "George, here is a book that I think you should read."
I eventually got some teachers who did that. In ninth grade, Creighton Bedford was my math teacher, and he gave me a book that I think that he used in writing his master's thesis or something on linear algebra. And he said, take the rest of the year off, because I was falling asleep in class, because I'm not only dyslexic, I'm also narcoleptic. And he said, just take this and read it on your own. And of course, it was way beyond what we were taking Algebra 1, and this was like graduate level linear algebra. But I loved it, and I used it. I programmed some exercises from it into the computer.
Okay, so there was an influential teacher at the right stage at the right time.
Right, but before ninth grade, there was almost nothing, yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the family tradition, because as I understand it, you bought a set of this series for your daughter, and then later your daughter became a mother and she bought a set for her children.
That's right. She and they love it the same way I did. They are also good. They have little vacuums in their brains, and they can you show them a picture, and they'll find the book, and they'll find the picture for you. Uh, when my daughter would, we found this perfectly round hole in the wood in our backyard, and it just looked kind of like maybe a bullet hole, and we were worried
Sure.
what it was, And she just ran out of the backyard into home, came back out with a book, opened it up to like page 250 something,
Right.
and there was a picture of carpenter bee, and it's like she had gone from this natural environment thing to something that she had seen before, and the grandchildren same way, is they're constantly pointing out things that I don't even know, and they'll pull the book and they'll prove it. And she used to do that with her nanny, and the nanny would doubt certain things, and she'd say, "Well, look, here it is," and pull out a little book, and
Sure.
she's like 2 or 3 year old, say, "This is how evolution works," and
I think that's really cool because I mean, basically,
um,
what you're saying is the family tradition is when you look for explanations, there's a place you go. That here's a
yeah.
series of books that may not have the complete answer to everything, but it's a starting point.
Yeah. I mean, there's a great tendency these days to look things up in Google. And in fact, my first granddaughter, that's how you could get her to do anything. That was her reward. Rather than candy, it was one Google search. But there's something to be said about a physical book that we all find even more attractive. If you can find it quickly in a book, um, it's somehow very real and rewarding. It's almost like going out in your backyard.
Yeah, I read a metaphor the other day that supports that. It said, basically when you read a book, it's a little bit like when you're on a mountain trail. With a book, you can kind of go back to where you were earlier on the trail, and you see a sign marker, but it doesn't actually mean that much until you get to that place. Then you go back and you understand the significance of what was actually being said, and you can flip into the future and go further up the trail. With an ebook, it's like you're on a mountain trail. You can't see what's behind you and you can't see what's ahead of you. You can only see what is right there in front of you.
Yeah, and the human brain is wired up for knowing locations, knowing places,
Sure.
and so a book kind of helps you create a place that is virtual and much bigger than any backyard can be. But it has the same kind of feeling. It kind of fits into the human brain where we can explore and remember.
Do you see it? I mean, I think books can be a kind of a bonding for families as well, particularly between generations. And I'm just kind of curious the difference between, say, your daughter's generation and now her daughter, who will be a full-fledged digital citizen, to see the difference in terms of how their perspective is getting shaped in a reading environment, which now includes digital images as well as physical books.
Yeah, so I mean, it's particularly noticeable during the time of COVID, um, where the 6-year-old granddaughter spends some time in an electronic community, and that's all she's got outside of her immediate family. But they still like the books, and part of this is grandparental and parental influence. Um, but it plays a big role having both the electronics and the various physical things. And the same thing goes for testing what you see in the book with simple everyday observations and experiments.
I'm just curious with your students as well. You must have over the years seen a difference in terms of people coming into the classroom who would have come before the time of the digital reading and those who are coming now. And if you could say a little bit about that divide within the context of these first time life series, which would have been a book world.
Yeah, I think, it's funny. Different people transition at different times. So I was already reading off computer screens back in the late '60s, early '70s, and people would ask me, "How can you read off a computer screen? It's just it's so unpleasant and jittery." And I said, "Well, it's about the same to me." But nevertheless, I'm still an advocate for a physical book, and books have events associated with them. So, for example, my daughter would read each of the J.K. Rowling books. They would come out at midnight, and she'd have them read
Yes.
by like 4 or 5 in the morning, and she was a reading fanatic from like age 2. And
From age
I
2.
think you don't have those events so much with an online book. We should, and you can't sign the books,
Sure.
quite as easily. There is software to do that, but almost nobody uses it.
Yeah, there's no question the book culture has been evolving, certainly in the digital age. What I'd like to do is go on to the biographies that you've chosen, and which I think opens up a wonderful terrain to explore. Just to list them, there's a biography of Luther Burbank, George Washington Carver, and Marie Curie, which you read between ages 10 and 12. And you said you tried some simple experiments inspired by each of these writers. Maybe what we can do is start with Luther Burbank. What inspired you to do that first grafting that you mentioned earlier?
Well, as I recall, there was an illustration where he had both various types of apples and maybe even pears growing on the same tree, and I thought that was really cool. And there was a discussion of how the roots could be better for a particular soil, but the branches gave better fruits, and I just thought that was cool. And so I just went out in the backyard and I grafted a branch. I took a branch from one part of the tree and grafted it onto another part of the tree, and then I started doing between trees, different species, and found out that not all grafts work, but the first ones I did work. And I just thought that was just fascinating. And later I found out that almost all seedless plants, which are very popular in the grocery stores now, are propagated by grafting. So in fact, quite a number of flowering plants and fruits and vegetables are grafting.
Let me just give a little bit of a background for readers who may not be that familiar with Luther Burbank. He was a quite well-known botanist, horticulturalist, and pioneer in agricultural science. He developed more than 800 strains and varieties of plants over a 55-year career. He was 113 prunes and plums, 10 different kinds of apples, blackberries, raspberries, strawberries, cherries, figs, grapes. And what was interesting, he was from Lancaster, Massachusetts, only had a high school education, went out to California, bought some land. He was 13th of 15 children in his family. And he had a very interesting career. It's difficult to know whether a career like that would be possible today, because he's someone who didn't keep very careful records, apparently. So that he wasn't that interested in scientific research per se, but his innovations were quite revolutionary in terms of his on-hands, practical, pragmatic approach to the whole issue of botany. So I think it's quite interesting. Again, it kind of fits in a little bit with what we were talking about earlier. Clearly, he's a bit of a fox. He's looking at multiple ways of doing things, and he's not quite satisfied with an academic or an intellectual approach. He's more interested in hands-on, getting his hands dirty in the garden, seeing what works and what doesn't work. And when it works, he knows that that's been a success. He doesn't maybe know scientifically why it was a success, but he knows that it has worked. Did that have an influence?
Well, certainly at the time, I had no idea what real science was. And in fact, I quite likely got interested in science for all the wrong reasons. But as I matured, what I got excited about also matured. And, maybe originally I was, interested in what you could do with chemistry to, blow things up, or
Sure.
what you could do with plants to make because food, but less so on the scientific method, on the hypothesis testing, but definitely interested in experiments, things that you could make, maybe the interface between engineering and science, although everybody called it science.
It was interesting as well as Burbank received a number of grants from the Carnegie Foundation. So he was one of kind of the original ones who had to file a proposal. And apparently Andrew Carnegie liked Burbank because he was not scientific in his methods, but very practical, as Carnegie was. So those would have been different days in which grants were applied for and rewarded than today.
In fact, all three of these biographies, I think, had in common that they were leaning towards the engineering side, or my interest in them lit. And I didn't self-describe as an engineer until decades later, partly because there was a stigma about engineering. It's like sanitation engineering or railroad engineer or something.
Right.
It wasn't like science. So even in Cape Canaveral, which was in the same state that I grew up in, they were all called rocket scientists, even though they really were not doing science by my reckoning today. They were called that because that was more distinguished, I think.
So I guess what you're saying, there was a little bit of a hierarchy where engineering was viewed less prestigious than being a scientist.
Yeah. And I think and I didn't really care. I just used whatever names that I said, well, I'm going to be a physicist or a scientist or something like that. But I think it became much more acceptable to be an engineer when, some of them, like, Bill Gates suddenly became extremely wealthy. And maybe even before that, when we started to recognize that many of the things that post World War II were really the result of exceptional chemical and physics based engineering.
Before we leave Burbank, I mean, one of the quotes from him was, "I love flowers, trees, animals, and all works of nature as they pass before us in time and space. What a joy life is when you have made a close working partnership with nature, helping her to produce for the benefits of mankind new forms, colors, and perfumes and flowers." Did that speak to you when you were 10, 11 years old?
A little bit. So my mother actually had an interest in horticulture as well. She was definitely a fox. I mean, she was not just law and psychology, but she had a degree in architecture and art, and she like finished college 2 years early, and she anyway, she had in her law practice, one of her clients couldn't pay her in cash, so he gave her 2 greenhouses full of orchids, and so I would help her grow the orchids, and we would give orchids to all of our friends, and it was quite an exotic ability to be able to give away orchids back then.
Well, that's an interesting anecdote because that fits very well why you would be attracted to the Burbank book to begin with, because there's a family tradition of valuing nature and plants and growing things and looking after them.
Right.
The other biography, which I think is very interesting, is George Washington Carver. Again, an African American who was an agricultural scientist, invented more than 300 products from peanut plants, and born in Diamond, Missouri in 1864 as a slave. And here is someone who would have overcome racism in a very raw kind of way, even after the Civil War, but was able to find his way to college in Iowa and became, I would think, maybe one of America's early leading celebrity scientists. I mean, he was admired by President Theodore Roosevelt. He had a connection with Mahatma Gandhi. And so he was someone who was known internationally as well as to an American audience. So what was it in the George Washington Carver story of his biography that gave you inspiration?
Well, like Luther Burbank, he was at the interface between sort of pure science on plants and applications. And I think I felt an affection or affiliation in some sense because, I consider myself from the South, not the negative connotations you might think of, but, he represented Southern agriculture, sweet potatoes and peanuts. And I just love the idea that he was making things in addition to foods. He patented a lot of recipes and so forth, but he also he would make like glues. And I as a young chemist, I was not so interested in fires and bombs like many of my other colleagues say that they were interested when they were young. I was more interested in like glues and putties and things like that. So I found that interesting.
I found a reference that he had created the Jessup Wagon, which was a mobile classroom to bring his lessons to farmers in the field. And so that it was quite an invention, as I think, at that time in formal education, which had been really consigned to the traditional classroom setting. And here he is using lateral thinking to say, well, they can't go to the classroom. Why not bring the classroom to the field?
Yeah. And we still do that to this day. I mean, there still are mobile classrooms and laboratories for teaching kids, especially, say, in the New York area.
Right. One of the things that seems to be a common link between George Washington Carver and Luther Burbank is they overcome some real obstacles and adversity in their life. And Carver, it was slavery, being black in a very racist kind of society. With Burbank, it was not having a university education and not really having the support or the respect of a scientific establishment. But those kind of obstacles did not deter them. It didn't stop them. They had a kind of persistence and perseverance that, looking at your career, I can see that you reflect the kind of determination, unstoppable. You have an idea, you pursue the idea.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly how much that inspired me, but it certainly somewhere or another I got the determination to was set back in school twice. I had all these reading disabilities to overcome. I also had to work hard to behave like other people when I was very young. And so, but perhaps these people, the overcoming obstacles, made it seem natural for me. I think I sort of felt that everybody had obstacles to overcome. My parents would share all their trials and tribulations, both in the present and in their past. And I just took it for granted that there were going to be a lot of things to overcome.
Okay,
and
so
I was
in other
not
words,
disappointed in that regard. There were plenty of things to overcome.
so at least with these two biographies of pioneers, both of them in agricultural pursuits, are inspiring. And it's interesting to see whose childhood heroes inspired them. And here are two men from very diverse backgrounds and different times, but with a kind of a common pursuit in agriculture, in botany, in making scientific changes. And so from a very early age, then, you were pursuing those kind of role models who were, in a sense, outsiders, but yet were able
Right.
to have the determination to make some difference in a very complex area such as botany or agriculture.
Yes.
The other author is Marie Curie, who has an astounding career. I think probably a lot of people have at least heard of her. What was your experience in reading her biography? The original biography was written, I think, 3 years after her death by her daughter, Eve, and is often put on the list of the top 10 biographies ever written by anyone. So it has a very powerful and enduring story. So when you read that at, say, 11 years old, it must have had quite an impact.
It did. I mean, she's just a remarkable person in every way. A lot of people think of her as a physicist and a chemist. In fact, she's the only person who's gotten 2 Nobel Prizes in 2 different scientific fields, as far as I know. And but what's interesting is she also was good at biology and medicine. So she did a lot with imaging through skin, so like X-ray. She had a mobile X-ray. Back to the idea of bringing the school to the people, that she would bring the X-ray device to the people at a time that was really needed. So there were just so many things about her that were fascinating, and her whole family was very talented as well. Both her husband and her daughter got Nobel Prizes. So she. It just struck me as kind of a warm family tradition that they could all share. That was just as important to me as the raw physics. And the one experiment I did that it's hard to do experiments on radioisotopes as a kid back in the 60s, but I did mess around with radium hands on watches and clocks. And I thought that was fascinating because I was familiar with the phosphorescence, which would fade very quickly after you turn off the lights. And then these they looked just like phosphorescence, but they were the decay of radium or tritium, which seemed to be endless in its energy. You didn't need batteries, and it was just tiny grains of material would keep glowing for what seemed like forever.
So the biography then of Marie Curie was inspiring you again to do some experiments, which she had been doing in her own lab. And by all accounts, the lab that she and her husband Pierre had was a quite crude place in which they worked, but that didn't seem to slow them down.
Yeah, to a kid, it actually, I think it was more exciting than if I had known how real science happened. Now I'm excited by real science, or modern science, I should say. They were both real. But she would get a train that would back up to her laboratory, a train car full of pitch blende, and then just like with brute force, pounding and grinding and extracting, tons of material. And I just thought that, to me, that was real science. And what I do now is we pipette with machines, even robots, tiny amounts of clear fluids, and you can't tell the difference between a clear fluid that has some amazing antibacterial or anti-cancer. They all look like clear fluids. But back then it was minerals by the truckload.
Yeah, well, probably the days of those kind of back garden homemade labs is over.
I'm not sure. I think the do-it-yourself scientist is something I've advocated for most of my life. Um, uh, and you have weather stations. People have had those gardens. Some people do pet breeding. I think there's a stronger interest in genetics now, not just ancestry, but people have home CRISPR experiments. Sometimes chemistry sets. I think it's there's some steady state level, even though a huge number of things are like so shrink wrapped and incomprehensible. I mean, you can no longer fix a car the way you used to because it comes in these
It's a
modules
computer.
where you pop in an entire module where the electronics is integrated with mechanical components.
Right.
But there's still some things that you can do it yourself or do it together.
It's one of the things that came up certainly with Marie Curie is the way she had dedicated so much of her life to pursue her interest, and that it seems like her daughter in the biography was documenting the cost and health and time, energy and personal interest as a result of that. Did that have any impact on you?
I don't remember that having an impact. I mean, partly it's because kids don't really uh, think of their mortality very much. Um, you know, so that's wasn't. I mean, she lived to what I considered a ripe old age. And it was something like 66 years old, which was beyond my fathoming. Uh, um,
Yeah.
I mean, and her husband died young, but not because of the radium burns that he had on his chest from carrying around this glowing, huge amount of radioactivity. He died of getting run over by a car or a horse carriage, whatever.
Right. But again, she had her own hardship. As I understand, after her husband died, she was up to be the chair of the physics department. And even though she'd won a Nobel Prize in physics 8 years previously, they denied her that position. And it's a bit controversial whether it was because she was a woman or whether it was because she was from Poland and not French. But in any event, she was denied that position.
Yeah, I suspect being a woman was a big component. Even years later, when Barbara McClintock was just as almost as exceptional a scientist as Marie Curie, um, the same thing applied. All those years, they wouldn't let them enter by the same door as the men into the National Academy of Sciences. Things like that. It was just crazy. I mean, and if you look at the distance between the 15th and the 19th Amendment, which gave the African Americans and women the votes. I mean, it took an extra 50 years. That's amazing that we can maintain that sort of bias for sort of such a long, and still do. There
Yeah.
still is.
Of these
But it's
three
like, do
biographies.
you have to get 2 Nobel Prizes and you still don't get no respect? I mean, what do you need to do?
Yeah, it's quite astounding, that history. It seems to be a contradiction because you have a physics department acting in an irrational way. You have obviously the best candidate, and it's for irrational reasons that the best candidate is being excluded.
Yeah, I actually think that there's a phenomenon in math and physics, and maybe in life in general, where you can go too far on rationality, you become hyper rational, and it's no longer rational in the ideal sense that they would like you to believe. It's rationalization. So you made up your mind, and then you construct ever more abstract and compelling to you arguments for why your gut is correct.
Right.
So this is sometimes referred to as the person on the elephant who's deciding why the direction the elephant is going is a good direction to go, rationalizing the decision
Yes.
that clearly the elephant made, not the rider.
David Hume, with
Yes, yeah,
the manute
exactly.
on the back of the elephant, our
Yeah,
emotions,
exactly.
and that's of these three books. Are these still relevant for a 10, 11, 12-year-old person today who's growing up? In other words, you would.
I think so because they almost tell like universal truths. So they're like mythology. They're like stories of Hercules and Odysseus,
Sure.
but we know that they're grounded in truth. There's very little distortion as far as I know. It's totally plausible modern stories, even though they haven't dated as far as I can tell. So yeah, I would recommend them to young people today.
So, recommending them because they tell a compelling story that remains relevant.
That they're exceptional, and there is a danger of telling stories about exceptional individuals because it's like selective reporting.
Sure.
You maybe make people's hopes too high. But there's another philosophy, which is if you shoot for the stars, maybe you'll land on the moon. And it's hard for anyone to realistically think they're going to be themselves a Luther Burbank or a George Carver or a Marie Curie. But why not try? Why not do the best you can and work hard like they did?
So, in a way, I think it's a very compelling message that you're making is that when you're young, you don't really think about it, but you can choose your mentors in a particular way. These three individuals and through their biographies, in some sense, became a mentor to George Church, opening up certain worlds through experiments and through just the courage of being able to do things to see if it works.
Absolutely. I would say that at least until I went away to school in Massachusetts in ninth grade, these were my only scientific and engineering mentors. They're all I had. And they got me a little closer to what real science was about. And so I wasn't blindsided by how different it was from what you would get from a regular elementary school education, which was mostly about memorization back then. Thankfully, we've gotten a little bit away from that, but back then it was very dry, and these books made it very wet and exciting.
Yeah.
They were humid, full of adventure.
Well, I hope that message resonates with viewers that if you're a parent and you've got children in this age bracket, you have a way of introducing mentors for the cost of a book. And you're listening to someone who found these books foundational to his own worldview and perspective and thought process. And that should give you a moment of reflection to think it may be possible for my son or my daughter to get that kind of inspiration.
I would encourage picture books too.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Younger kids can relate to the picture books on their own without needing someone to read it to them necessarily.
I think it's an interesting point you're making, and it's really a balance between a world of visualizations, which is photographs, paintings, graphs, and that's one of the things that the internet does exceptionally well, is provides daily hundreds, if not thousands, of different images that register on some kind of level. And at the same time, wedding that visualization with the world of knowledge that's locked into words that have to be decoded by your brain in order to understand what those words mean in regard to whether it's an experiment or whether it's explaining an image.
Yep.
So I think that's leads us to the sixth of your choices, which has the largest age range, age 8 to age 66, and that's the Bible, the King James Version of the Bible. And you tell a wonderful story about how one of your mentors showed you a copy with a bullet hole part way through, and it was from someone who was a minister in World War II. Tell us that story.
Well, so he was visiting for the day, and we had been exposed to sermons and Sunday school and so forth. But this was a special occasion where he had a collection of Bibles. He had like one of the world's smallest Bibles that he carried around with him, and it was like really tiny print. And I thought that was a marvel of engineering. And he had Bibles that were so dog-eared and annotated that you could tell he had really spent a lot of time studying this particular Bible. And then he had this pocket Bible that would sit in his shirt pocket that had a bullet hole. I mean, I have no reason to believe he would make that up. I mean, in addition to the fact that he was trying to set a good moral example for us, it really looked like a bullet hole. And so, it wasn't so much I wanted to believe in miracles that a Bible could stop a bullet. It was more that just this guy had an exciting life. He was a minister who walked the walk. He didn't just stay hidden. He was out on the battlefield, and I thought that was really amazing. And and I was in an unusual position. I had been quite exposed to Catholicism, Protestant, and Judaism essentially from birth. And as I grew older, early in high school, I started studying comparative religions. And so again, the fox is growing up. But I just found that the cosmopolitan nature of my mentors who were in the ministry. It was one of the few things I considered actually intellectual in my week. I looked forward to the sermons, because the sermons were clearly a work of art. They were constructed. We were personal friends with the pastor and his family. They had 2 kids, exactly the age of my sister and myself, and genders matched as well. And I would watch them, think about a sermon on Saturday, the day before, and it was just, that wasn't what I got in school, but it wasn't something I got for half an hour on Sunday.
Right. Do you feel you grew up in a kind of a religious family background? Was that a part of family life? Bible reading together?
No, not so much. It was, everybody in the South, where I was at the time, was going to church. We would all dress up We wear ties and nice dresses, and it was an event. It was a social event. I think my parents were extremely open-minded, and the congregation as a whole was for all three, Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish. They all seemed quite open-minded to me, to other and respectful of other people's religions, which I found quite interesting.
One of the things that's interesting about this particular selection, given all of your research in science, is the divide between the world of faith and the world of evidence, which is, of course, a division that's come up recently, but it's a very old one. Usually you find people on one side of the divide or the other. You're obviously someone who doesn't find that to be a contradiction.
No, again, I think we need to avoid the hyper-rationalism where you're confusing rationalization with rationale. I think it's important to consider that religion is a real part of billions of people's lives. There are many more people that have faith than lack it. And so if you want to understand the world and the social fabric, denial is not the most rational route, in my opinion. I think it's comparative studies, I think, particularly help illuminate that, because you can see what's in common and what's different. Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, Hindu faith. And these are, I think it helps you understand the human condition and how we can communicate with people that are different from our own cultural background.
I'm just wondering, again, going back to some of the earlier books, particularly where we started out on the Time Life Science, that's quite a different world than the world of the Bible, where you have prophecies and miracles and this kind of storytelling. Is that science tells stories as well. It tells a different kind of story. And it really, I guess what I'm looking at is, from an early age, you're exposed to two very different kinds of ways to tell a story. One is a biblical kind of story, and another is a kind of a Burbank way of a story about how you graft raspberry or strawberries, or radium in the case of Marie Curie, or peanuts in the case of George Carver. So there is a different kind of processing that goes on. And I'm just curious of how that coalesced together in your mind growing up, those two different kinds of storytelling traditions.
Yeah, they were. I never found them that far apart. I was never tempted to adopt the religion of atheism, particularly, although I lumped it in with the comparative religions.
Sure.
Many atheists were more dogmatic than I felt in a lot of the religions ministers that I had met. But you say prophecies and miracles are not that far away from science. So science strives hard to predict things that are not intuitive, that don't make sense at first. They require a leap of faith. For example, quantum physics is very counterintuitive. Spooky action at a distance.
Sure.
Being able to predict eclipses, that was considered miraculous when people figured out how to do that. And terrifying to people that didn't know how to predict. So, and in many religions, when they say that there is a miracle, they want to document it. They care about the physical world. Many, not all, but they, when you want to get sainthood, then you have to have a certain number of unlikely events. It's not that they're impossible. It's just that they're extraordinarily unlikely. Someone will recovered from a normally fatal cancer. So to determine whether it's a miracle, you have to pass some probabilistic threshold, whether it's framed in that form or not. And scientists often have all kinds of faith that other scientists have accurately summarized years of work, because you can't repeat every experiment. I try my best to repeat as many experiments as I can, but they're a vast number, so you have to take those on faith. You have to have faith that what you're doing is a good thing, because there are plenty of examples where science has not done the right thing. But you have to have faith that, well, we made mistakes in the past, but now we got it straight. No more cane toads or foxes in Yellowstone or other invasive species and atomic bombs and things like that. We got it now. We got it now. That's faith.
Okay. So you're saying, really that science and religions both depend on faith as a way forward, and they're telling stories of faith in different kinds of ways. I'm curious, again, going back to your kind
and
of
they both
early
depend on evidence. They need it. They want evidence. They want to prove to you that the miracle is a physical. If it were pure faith, you wouldn't need miracles. You wouldn't need to raise people from the dead or cure cancer,
or turn water into wine, or part the Red Sea.
Exactly. These are things that happen in the physical world that could have a scientific explanation, or they could prove, because they're so unlikely, that you had faith in the right thing.
Do you remember when you were a kid growing up, a Bible story that really stuck in your mind as a kind of a profound epiphany for you?
Oh, there are so many. We could take up hours. But I remember one of them was one of the proverbs about the lilies of the field. They toil not, neither do they reap. But I say unto you that Solomon in all his glory was never arrayed as such as these. It wasn't that I wanted to be lazy. It was just this idea that there was a certain natural power that came from natural hard work. You didn't have to do anything exceptional. And then the concept of turning the other cheek, I found a very powerful concept, very counterintuitive at first. And then that you would allow someone to hit you twice rather than strike back. And in fact, that's how I behaved, not because of church, but it just seemed very natural to me. The first time someone hit me in the face, gave me a black eye, I did nothing in response. And the second time and the third time, eventually somebody broke their hand on my face, broke all the bones in their hand. I had to get pins in them, but I didn't hit back. So really, those two things resonated with me.
Yeah, it's interesting. So really, the Bible would have provided an ethical, moral foundation, as opposed to the books that we're discussing earlier. You would read and you would go out and say, I want to try that experiment. I want to do something in a lab. I need something to be able to see if I can replicate that. But with the Bible, it was basically, in a social situation, there are ways of dealing with this internally, of taking a punch.
Right. I wouldn't say there was there wasn't a big divide for me from science or religion. So, for example, I think that those three, Burbank, Carver, and Curie, had in common that they wanted to use their science for the public good. They wanted to make better foods, better glues, and better medical devices and bring them to the people. I think what was interesting about the sermons that I would hear is the moral dilemmas that we created. It wasn't so much, here is an algorithm for behaving morally. It wasn't just turn the other cheek. Here's where it gets complicated. What if your two commandments conflict? Your parents tell you to kill somebody, right?
Right.
Which commandment, the honoring your parents or the thou shalt not kill,
Yeah.
comes into play here? And I found that intellectually very interesting. Is they weren't saying, "Oh, it's simple, just do this and you'll be fine." It was more about, what about these corner cases, these
Sure.
gray zones? What do you do? And I found that fascinating.
The
To this
trolley
day,
car problem.
trolleys. Yeah, exactly. I think the problem with the trolley car is not whether you go to the right and hurt fewer people than if you let it keep going to the left. It's, why are there people allowed on the tracks at all? you know, it's an engineering problem. You shouldn't allow people to be on the tracks.
Well,
Anyway,
that's a
that's
brilliant
my
example,
orthogonal solution to the trolley problem. Yeah.
a brilliant way of reframing the problem to make it a different problem.
Right. Yeah.
Let's move on to Basic Programming by John G. Kemeny and Thomas E. Kurtz, who were professors at Harvard. This book, I think, came out in 1967 or so.
I think they were at Dartmouth when I read.
They were at Dartmouth. Yes.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. This is really the whole start of the programming and designing algorithms at the very, very early stages. Could you tell us a little bit about how you came to get a hold of this book at age 14, which was befuddling students at Dartmouth who were a lot older than you and who were in university programs?
Well, I was already obsessed with computers by the time I left home and went to Massachusetts. Left Florida and went to Massachusetts for ninth grade. I had become infatuated at the World's Fair when I was 10 years old with these animatronic representation of Lincoln, which to me was a computer, that was a robot. That's what it should be. And I went back home, and there was nothing. Like I said, it was in a vacuum with respect to science, engineering, computers, and so forth. There was nothing for me in 1964. So I started building, analog computers with the help of family electrician that would do Kirchhoff's laws and things like that. And but I really wanted to work on a digital computer, and it wasn't as soon as I hit the ground at this new school, I had this gut feeling that there was going to be a digital computer somewhere. And I asked around, and eventually I found that there was one in the basement of Morse Hall, which is a math building, which was completely unused. I mean, the lights were out all the time. There was no furniture in there, but there was a teletype, like the reporters, the AP teletypes, that was hooked up to Dartmouth. So we were in Andover, Massachusetts, and this was hooked up by, something way pre-internet, pre-ARPANET to via some kind of phone lines or something. And I just started typing on it. I didn't have a manual, but I just knew that there had to be a way. And I would hit return, and it would come back with what? The question, WHAT question mark. And this was a big step up from my analog computer where I had to have like rheostats and galvanometers and stuff. And it could actually talk, it was saying what? And I just thought, oh man, this is like an intelligent computer. This is even better than Abraham Lincoln, who was just simulating a person. And but then I found that everything I typed in there got what in response. I was a little disappointed, and so I had to go off and get this book to figure out how to get something other than what.
And so at age 14,
and I learned BASIC and Fortran more or less at the same time, but I only had a book for one of them.
So at age 14, you were really reading a very sophisticated manual that would have prepared you for a scientific career.
I didn't think of it that way. I just thought that they spoke my language somehow. I don't know what it was that fascinated me about it. I mean, it was just like it was the artificiality of it, where it could simulate things, simulate observations, help us do calculations. Yeah, but I guess I was aiming for science and engineering with those. It was like an experiment too. It was like the instant gratification experiment. You would change the code and hit return, and boom, it would come right back. This was, in a certain sense, before I learned about card punches. This was much more like the interactive programming we have today. It was like ahead of its time. But you'd hit return, and it would either work or not work, and you change it, and a second later you'd have a new answer. So way faster than any other experiment that you would do in garden or laboratory.
I'm seeing a little bit of a pattern there with the Burbank book, where you could see the experimentation and go out and try that grafting yourself. And the same thing with this book, which allowed you a foothold into a new world to see if you can make something work, which they assure you should work if you do steps X, Y, and Z.
Exactly. And you could mutate it to make something that nobody has ever made before, but based on what you've learned so far. I mean, you can mutate it and try it out. It was very much like what I later learned was genetics. Is you'd have a bunch of code in zeros and ones, or in ACs, Gs, and Ts, and you could mutate them, and you could see what happens. Sometimes it would just break. Sometimes it would do something cool. And that's, on the topic of reading and writing books, I also read and write DNA, and in fact wrote a book in DNA, which should have then read with machines that we had built. So there's a lot of parallels between reading and writing books and reading and writing DNA, which we brought together into one experiment where we wrote and read a book, my only book in DNA.
Well, this is why you're an original thinker. You're able to bring together things that most people would see as in separate categories, and to think of DNA as another canvas in which to communicate knowledge is one which goes right back to when you were doing those grafting in your parents' garden, to right through the basic programming at age 14. You start to see that there's a pattern that's developed there. I'd like to move on because we're getting a little bit short on time. There are the last two books on your reading list is I, Robot by Isaac Asimov, and the last one is John Irving's book, A Prayer for Owen, Meany. So the I, Robot book is very well known, certainly in literary and scientific communities. It was a series of stories that Asimov wrote from 1940 to 1950, 9 of them that were fixed up in a novel with a chief scientist who was a robo-psychologist at U.S. Robots and Mechanical Men, Inc. And it is Dr. Susan Calvin who tells each of the stories to a reporter in the 21st century. Now, of those 9 stories, and they have titles such as Liar, Evidence, The Evitable Conflict. Which of those stories did you find compelling, living in influence, that you went back to, that had an impact?
Well, so it's been a very long time since I've read this. I remember it's very different from the movie that Will Smith was in. It has some similarities. But a thing that I liked about it was the theme that we talked about before, which was this ethical dilemma, because you essentially had what looked like very simple rules. If you just had 3 rules and algorithms to implement them. But what happens when you get into conflicts? So, for example, one of them was they had a robot that had to go rescue some humans, and it had to go through a very some kind of poisonous gas, something that was corrosive to the robot. And so it had these three rules, to protect humans, to not allow them to come to harm, and to protect themselves. And so it would go towards the humans to rescue them, and then it would see this corrosive gas, and then it would start doing loops, and the loops would start getting bigger and bigger rather than getting closer and closer, because it was trying to self-preserve while it was trying to get to them, and it was just wasting time and getting corroded anyway. So it's an example, the same kind like the sermons. It's not that we have a simple set of ethical rules, it's we have a way of thinking that allows us to solve problems when things come into conflict. I particularly like that aspect of it.
Yeah, one of the themes that's going through all of these books is you were, from a very early age, comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty, that you took it as natural, that there was not necessarily a simple answer, that it was okay to have a moment where there is no one right way or right answer. There are multiple options, all of them having certain risks, certain benefits.
Absolutely. I would say that that's probably one of the things that I find attractive, and as a consequence, I've gotten better and better at. You get better at whatever you spend a lot of time on, and I love ambiguity, and it's not so much about staying in the ambiguity; it's about solving the ambiguity and moving on to the next one. It's all about solutions rather than hand wringing and worrying. It's dealing with the ambiguities that fascinates me.
But I think it's a wonderful lesson because there's a comfort of coming to terms with a world where there is ambiguous situations, and not to get angry because someone won't tell you absolutely what is the best choice, that it's left to you to make a choice. And there are all kinds of factors that go into that paralyzes some people. It makes other people curious and allows them to go forward to do the best they can with the information they have.
Exactly.
So it's like one of the stories was called Liar, about this robot named Herbie who could read other people's minds. Now, you could read people's minds so you would know when they're lying. So the question is, if they're lying, do you tell the other person that this person is lying to you? Does that violate the three rules that Asimov had? A robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm, for example. And so the great thing about these stories is they're not easily resolvable. And so I could see where iRobot fits very much into the matrix of, yes, this is confirming a world of ambiguity. He has these three rules, but the rules have holes in them that are big.
Yeah, I think the attraction for me was not that they were impossible to resolve, it's that they were hard to resolve. Big difference. And the fact that the more creativity it required, it's kind of like Sherlock Holmes stories were fascinating because they were hard to solve, but they were not impossible. And in the end, you had a resolution, but then you moved on to the next one and the next one, the next one. So, it was that was the attraction.
The last book is John Irving's A Prayer for Owen Meany, which you, I think, read in 1989. You were 36 years at the time you read it, and your daughter read it a few years later at age 5 or 6. I mean, that is impressive that she read that book at age 5 or 6.
Well, she had already been reading for 3 or 4 years at that point. I think I read excerpts to her initially. And once you have a context, then you read a little bit here and there. And she did like a book report on it in first or second grade. She made a little like diorama moving device that represented some of the the narrative. She found it fascinating. I think she found it more fascinating than I did. I think she found it fascinating in the same sense. It was weird ideas. It was like why I liked, the Ripley's Believe It or Not or the Time Life series. It exposed me to ideas I had not seen before. These ideas were much less foreign to me as a 36-year-old than they were to her as a 5-year-old.
Sure.
And I eventually bought her a armadillo, a taxidermy armadillo, because that figured prominently in the book. And she still has it, decades later.
Interesting. So, the book really is about spirituality. It's about faith. It's about social justice. It's about a relationship of two boys growing up. Owen, who has this belief that he will have a certain kind of death as a hero, and his friend, and it goes through time frames. I'm just wondering what aspect of that story was really compelling for you.
Well, I felt very somehow oddly aligned with Owen. He had a strange physiognomy and a physical appearance and voice. He was an outsider. He couldn't quite relate to people as everybody else did. He was not a regular kid, while his friend was much closer to a regular kid. And so he felt that there must be a reason why he was different. And I thought that was interesting. And he also did a lot of practice for something he didn't even know what he was practicing for. They were shooting baskets together, the very strange type of maneuver that they were practicing. And he just didn't know what it was for. And I like that idea. The idea, it's like Orr in Catch-22, where he keeps messing around with gadgets and keeps crashing his plane. It's as if he's practicing for something much bigger than his day-to-day activities.
Yes. Yeah. So that book in some ways fits right back with the biographies of Burbank and Curie and Carver. Again, it's about an outsider who has this inner voice, who has this inner compulsion to not accept obstacles, but to have faith in themselves. So your selection of books really are a testament to a way of reconfirming the faith in your own talents, your own abilities, your own limitations, understanding a world of ambiguity, of puzzles, of contradictions, and being curious about that world. Is that a fair summary?
I think that is a fair summary. And in fact, I think I've learned a great deal from this conversation. I mean, I just picked these books literally because they're the first ones that came to mind. They must have made an impact on me, but I never really thought through their interconnections and how their impact on me. So this has been an extremely valuable exercise. I appreciate the chance to just talk this.
Well, I know you have to go, and I really want to thank you for this conversation. I think it's been illuminating. I think there are people right around the world who will watch this, will learn from this, and I hope that there will be young children who will watch this, who will be inspired by someone who is renowned globally for the innovations you've made. You are truly an original thinker. The chance to do a little bit of decoding of how that original mind came to be has been my great pleasure. I want to thank you, George Church.
And thank you. Right back at you.
Okay. You take care.
Okay.